Thank you all for coming out to building security into projects. We'll begin in just a minute. Let people make their way from the breakout. Well, about 30 minutes today for presentation. Walk through a couple of examples and then take some questions from all of you. So without further ado, my name is Kelly Vance. I'm a senior director with McAfee Professional Services, part of Intel Security. I'm here to talk to you today about building security in, understanding security from the build, plan, and operate approach. What should be done and what shouldn't be done to make it work in the real world. Just a quick overview. We'll be discussing how to identify requirements, how to proceed once the requirements have been identified, and the importance of documenting those requirements, some frameworks and methodologies that you can use within the state of California, and walk through a couple of examples. Just to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of perspective on where I'm coming from and why I'm here with you today, it'd be important for you to understand a little bit about my background. So I began working in IT security about 20 years ago with the Air Force, where data classification, data labeling, and data handling were very important. The risks to disclosure or unauthorized use of data was very well defined. But those organizations tend to move very slow, much slower than enterprises. So I went into corporate security, worked at a service desk to understand the user perspective, had several roles in desktop support, server operations, business operations, and ultimately the design of security controls, patch management, configuration management, and change control. But understood that I didn't know all the answers. I still wanted to learn, so I went into consulting and professional services to understand how other organizations, including the state of California, are addressing their challenges, what I could learn from the state, and what I could provide and share lessons with the state. So oftentimes when people think about security on an IT project, they think about the technical controls, the firewalls, the ACLs, the host intrusion and network intrusion prevention systems, antivirus, and those physical things that are already in their infrastructure that are commonly and ultimately requirements that, if they're looking at a policy and procedure base, may get overlooked. So we've got to start thinking beyond the current technical controls and start thinking about the processes, the procedures, and the requirements. We also need to recognize that security is a process, and you have to begin somewhere. You could begin by taking a reactive approach to a current threat to mitigate the immediate risk, but that provides little value. It makes you highly reactive and doesn't get you up into a compliant or a proactive approach to security. Those areas and that thinking gets you beyond the technology. It aligns operational processes and technical controls to risk assessment, compliance requirements, policy objectives. It gets you around the value curve into an operational state where you can assess your current processes, identify threats, make modifications to your architecture, and ultimately take advantage of the opportunities that you've learned from the threats and the risks that are exposed. That approach also allows us to think holistically, think beyond the controls to include the people and the processes. Start with the requirements that you already know and then expand from there. Take one small piece at a time, incorporate lessons learned from your experience on different projects, and expand your awareness. Look at your stakeholder requirements to mitigate risk. Review incidents, how you responded, what could be done better the next time. And a lot of times, the requirements that you already know begin with the internal administrative control requirements, things that are identified in the State Administrative Manual and the State Information Management Manual. Those requirements are constant, and in many cases, they're aligned to external standards. We'll get to those in a moment. A common framework outside of state government is ISO 27002, which identifies several control clauses, security categories, and 114 controls that can be implemented to mitigate risk to an acceptable level. The State Information Manual, Chapter 5300, aligns very closely with ISO 27002. And those controls are designed to provide reasonable assurance that an objective can be met. It also provides a means for the organization to measure their operational maturity. We have processes that are non-existent. We have processes that are defined, but people aren't necessarily following them. And it allows us to improve through measurement our risk mitigation activities. Oftentimes, it's simple enough to take an approach, a data-centric approach. Both ISO and the SAM require that the ownership of assets, including data assets, are identified. So there's a clear owner who's responsible for the protection of the data. The labeling of that information to identify its value is also a requirement outlined in the state manual, as are handling of assets, access control policies, and information security requirements and analysis, which gets us to the fundamental approach for building security in. You can look at the SAM, identify the requirements, and use many of these things as a simple checklist. Also, thinking holistically and around that value wheel, plan to have an iterative approach. You're not going to be able to identify and execute all the requirements at once, so prioritize them. And then go through an agile methodology and go back through your second iteration. Implementation guidance is further outlined in the SAM to identify how these objectives can be accomplished. There are established frameworks that can be applied to multiple scenarios to allow you to think holistically and iterate through this process to provide continuous service improvement. Once again, each state agency is responsible for the integration of information security and privacy within their organization. So how do you proceed? You can look externally at legislative, regulatory requirements, or external standards, taking a data-centric approach to classifying the information and gathering requirements from external sources. If your agency accepts payment cards for processing of licenses or other aspects, you might need to comply with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. If you're taking a service level management approach, you might be concerned with ITIL service management concepts like availability and redundancy and service design. What's the service we're providing to our citizens? What's the availability requirements of those services? And things of that nature. You could also move towards an internal focused approach by looking at your contractual agreements between your vendors, your partners, and other service providers. Things for data protection, how data is going to be transmitted from the state to an external entity. Encrypted while in transit, how is the data going to be stored once they receive it? How long can they retain it? What do they need to do to disclose a data breach back to the state? And you can also look at the requirements that are identified in the internal controls in the SIM and the SAM. The service management objectives, service level agreements between the constituents, interdepartment agency transfers for systems availability, and service level objectives for uptime, mean time between failures, and other responsiveness measures. But ultimately, you can also turn to the project stakeholders, your agency CISOs, your other department agency representatives, to get their perspective on why a new system needs to go in, what are the availability requirements, the data requirements, privacy requirements, and document those in a project scope and charter at the beginning of the project. You can take a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. Either is effective. Both can be iterated through. But it's very important to document the requirements. So where do we document those requirements? Oftentimes, this is a project management discipline. Those requirements can be documented in the project charter. It identifies which systems, which data, which agencies are going to be in scope of the project, which agencies, data, and systems are going to be out of scope or moved into subsequent phases. That, once again, allows us to iterate through a deployment of a system. The project stakeholders can provide you measurable project objectives, success criteria, and identify what are the project success criteria, who decides the project is successful, and it ultimately gives you some requirements traceability. The intended design met the objectives of the stakeholder, the project sponsors have signed off. That begins with resource planning and resource management, and ultimately the project plan. Bringing the team together to identify the project requirements, discuss the business and project objectives, identify the business applications that are going to be involved in this IT project that need to be secured. Set some common high-level design discussions. And just, if you're migrating from a previous service, discuss what that service provided, what the new service is intended to provide, so there's no disruption in operations or the service that's provided to your constituents. Even before the project planning has been completed, a lot of agencies and companies start thinking about the technical design. They've fallen back to, we have a firewall, we need to put a firewall in front of this system. We have a host intrusion prevention application, we need to put that on this system. But they need to stop and slow down a little bit and get back to the requirements. Availability, what are the true security requirements based on the classification of the data that's going to be served, stored, or processed on the system. As a best practice, the project manager doesn't need to have all the answers. They just need to know who to call upon and who to engage in the early phases of the project. Now they can start thinking about the technical design. If they have identified the requirements up front during the planning phase, they can design once so that the solution can be operated continuously, which is the key goal. You don't want to have to go back and reinvent the wheel, incur delays that may delay the project and cost more money. Also, as a best practice, use the currently available guidance, tools, and templates that are available as checklists and your starting point. Look internally for controls first, and then look externally for those legislative and regulatory requirements. Further, identify and define the policy requirements. Discuss the users, the roles, and responsibility so you can incorporate things like the principle of least privilege, who needs to have access, when, times of day, all those critical security controls.
You mentioned tools and templates. Are there some available?
Yes, there are. There's an outline at the end, and we'll get to that in a minute. So what are some of the frameworks and methodologies that are currently available, both externally and internally, to help you think holistically and help you take this iterative approach while managing the project successfully. The first, FIPS 199, allows you to help classify through security categories the data and information that a system will process based on its confidentiality, integrity, availability, and the impact if that data or system was not available or was unintentionally or intentionally disclosed. Each state entity must understand the value of the information systems and the level of protection those systems require. That includes data assets. If you're an application developer charged with collecting some information and you're part of a project, start thinking about the need to collect the data. Is the data already collected in another system? So you're not that you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, but you're reducing the number of baskets that you have to protect. If there are already data interchange agreements between state agencies that hold information and need access to other information, use that existing infrastructure before designing something else that needs to be protected. And as a best practice, classify your data. Once again, thinking holistically, move beyond the technology alone, but the business problem or solution that the system or project you're implementing is intended to provide. If you apply a business-driven approach, thinking beyond technology or security, you can also use existing enterprise architecture tools and processes. That enterprise architecture allows different perspectives from the different stakeholders to be identified so that the requirements can be documented as part of the project plan and allows the group to work collaboratively to facilitate a unified vision for the product or solution being deployed. The enterprise architecture often includes a baseline current state architecture, as well as a defined target architecture that comes out of the design discussions, and a sequencing plan to realize the target architecture, deploy the solution securely over a defined period of time. The Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework is one tool to allow you to think holistically. The state has also adopted this enterprise architecture framework, the CEAF version 2, I believe is the current version. And it allows you to think using a business-driven approach from a performance reference model. What are the inputs, outputs, and desired incomes of the solution, the goals of the project, to drive a business requirements model, which agencies are going to be in scope. This is a statewide effort or a single agency or department or multiple agencies over time. Breaking things down into smaller pieces, we can look at the service component reference model. It allows us to look at things in small pieces and gets us to a data reference model where we can look at a business-focused data standardization based on the FIPS 199 classifications for information and your SIM requirements to label data, confidential, secret, or top secret, to use a simple military analogy. With those labels, it's clear to the user or the systems administrators the value that that information has so they can apply the proper security controls. And last but not least, we're getting to the technical reference model where people now can start to put in things like access controls, log-on banners, warnings as deterrent controls for unauthorized access to systems, then monitoring and preventative controls like firewalls, network IPS solutions, and advanced persistent threat or ATD type solutions. So breaking down and combining the data classification requirements with the enterprise architecture view, we begin to see that we can ask questions during the planning and design phase. What data is collected? Who needs access? Where is it going to be stored? How is it going to be processed? What are the threats and risks to the data that I'm collecting and storing? Who are the people that need to be involved in the project at the top level state or agency? Who is missing from the project team? Do we have risk and compliance involved? What about internal audit? Are the roles and responsibilities properly documented as part of the project plan? Thinking from the bottom up, we know that we have several security products from Intel and McAfee. Is the EPO admin engaged? Do we have the proper server administrators so they know system changes need to be made? Do we have a SQL Server admin engaged to determine if we have enough capacity to deploy a new service? And what about our web administrators, email administrators, and other application owners who a security change might impact? Have they been communicated to? Are they aware and informed? And then what are the various motivations of these different personas? The CIO, CISO, or your agency department, CISOs, may be interested in ensuring compliance, mitigating risk. From a service resource management perspective, they may be looking to collapse systems and combine them to achieve some service and cost efficiencies. What are the internal and external requirements that the business needs to follow? FISMA, NIST, HIPS 199, as well as the internal controls with the SIM and the SAM. And then what's our timing? Is there a legal deadline? Are we trying to respond to an event or prepare for future planning, budgetary cycles, and things of that nature? New license acquisitions, technology refreshes, all of those things to help save cost, improve service, and improve security. Getting a bigger view, you can also see that there's more things to consider as you iterate through this. From a business requirements perspective, what are the existing administrative controls that we can leverage? What are the existing technical controls? Where are our gaps? How can we mitigate risk and close some of those gaps? Using things like risk assessments, continuity planning, and privacy requirements. Thinking through an ITIL service reference model, we can look at the availability requirements of the service, the capacity requirements, and start to document during our project planning phase the design requirements and other service requirements of the solution. We can incorporate the service desk so that the end users have a first line response, a first line corrective action, and the people who are on the front lines responding to user questions know how to resolve common problems or can interpret the end user experience to make the security rollout, the controls, more effective and remain in place so that users aren't calling to disable things when they're not clear why something's been put in or why they're seeing a new dialogue, a new graphic, a new pop-up or warning. So to your question, the framework resources that are available currently within the state include the SIM, the SAM, a feasibility study report template is available that helps document some of the service resource management requirements and the security management requirements. Is there a system owner? Has the system owner classified the data? What other agencies need to be involved in reviewing this feasibility study? FIPS 199 available publicly along with FIPS 200 and the NIST Special Publication 853, Rev 4 for assessing risk. SIM 5300 applies to all state agencies and has the control selections from which you can choose to mitigate your risk to an acceptable level. So I'll summarize briefly and then walk through a couple of examples of where project management, requirements identification have been successful. So for project managers, your key takeaways are to expand the project team, include the data owners, and the security architects that are familiar with the internal requirements outlined in the SIM and the SAM. Application developers and technical engineers, limit the data that you collect. The data has value and it represents a risk where it's not protected. Think holistically. Don't think at the technology layer alone, but what is the service requirement or the business requirement that's intended, and use the CEAF as a guide to ask those questions. Who needs to be involved? What's their motivation? What are they trying to achieve? How can the requirements be traced back through the project plan to determine project success? And for security leaders, approach the controls from a security risk categorization. Protect the sensitive data as priority 0, then follow on with priority 1 and priority 2, starting with your top secret, your secret, then your confidential, followed by your public information. And everyone can use the currently available policies, procedures, templates, and other toolkits that are available on the state's website. So a couple of examples. One California state agency knew that they were collecting personal and sensitive information, but they didn't know where that information was going or how it was being used. So they wanted to bring in a McAfee control to help them determine the risk and the data transfer. McAfee and Intel Security provided staff augmentation to help implement the configuration in a lab environment. One of the reasons for doing this in a lab was because the solution that they needed had high availability requirements that could be configured using Microsoft cluster services. But the operations team didn't have experience administering a cluster server. So we put it in the lab while they could hire the skills that they needed prior to implementing this in production to prevent a service outage. The design incorporated test data to validate and test that the controls were properly designed to identify and protect the personal and sensitive information this agency collected, and that proper monitoring and preventative controls could be implemented. The data classification controls were developed based on the agency data labeling practices for identifying sensitive information. And the cluster configuration was tested in the lab. It met the objectives for failover, and they could follow that design when they moved to production. Ultimately, at the end, capacity planning guidance and modeling was provided to the agency for use with their production deployment. And it follows some of the applicable state of California requirements identified in the SIM. Another agency outside of California had a similar situation. They knew they were collecting sensitive information, but their requirements weren't fully defined or developed. They quickly moved beyond their business approach to what the technology solution could provide to some technology features that didn't necessarily mitigate risk. They began focusing on things like controlling the distribution of MP3 files across their agency, controlling pictures of things, right? Things that had little impact if they were disclosed, while forgetting about the things that presented a high risk. The project team wasn't formed. It was simply a group of technology engineers. They took a technology-led approach rather than a business-led approach. And they missed some of their basic practices and common IT security controls, such as information system backup, system accreditation, system approval, and risk assessment. The solution that they implemented was live for over a year, and the following year, the service that they were providing to their agencies became corrupted. They didn't have proper change control or configuration management and were unable to quickly rebuild the system to restore that service to operation. So remember your core IT security operations and your security requirements, and base your controls on a risk assessment. Thank you all for your time and attention. Are there any questions? Yes?
What happens to when you find an agency that they are going through data classification and they tell you that all their data is sensitive, and how do you go about in helping them out to identify
So for those of you who couldn't hear the question, if you're going through a data classification exercise and an agency is telling you all of their data is sensitive and should be treated equally, you probably need to get the system and data owners involved to really understand what data is collected and why do you think credit card numbers and social security numbers represent the same risk as some other information. You can look to the internal controls in the SIM and the SAM to help answer the questions in a consultative manner for that system and data owner. And if that doesn't provide you enough guidance, look at the external standards, the NIST requirements for system classification, security categorization, and ask them questions on impact. Right? If this data was inadvertently disclosed, who do you have to notify? What are the legal ramifications? And what's the cost? Right? I think in the state of California, you need all three pieces for a disclosure to actually occur, something that's personally identifiable, along with like driver's license and social security number. If only one of those items is disclosed, it doesn't present as great a risk as if all three are disclosed.
But in a situation where how to, like, the disability, like a diagnosis and maybe the name of the person, and how does that create a violation of a breach? And how do you go about it? Like for instance, if you're using data loss prevention and you're dealing with the content and you want to prevent the from a data classification process, have you guys gone into environments where people have done the classification of the data, from that point of view, from a diagnosis and the name of the person, not just maybe social security number and the name of the person?
So it sounds like you might be interested in like protected health information?
Right.
Sure. So there's lots of things. So a diagnosis alone, without the identity of a person, it's meaningless, right?
I mean when it has a identity, how do you go about it?
Sure.
Because some of the challenges that, when you're implementing data loss prevention, and when it comes to that type of identifying that data, that is protected, how do you go about making that classification be real?
So part of the classification, it's easy to identify a diagnostic code, but it's difficult to identify a person's name without some manual intervention or manual review. So one of the ways you could do it is look at the volume of hits, right? The volume of diagnostic codes that have been disclosed, the type of event. Someone wrote something that had a diagnostic code to a USB device, but it was blocked. Then they turned around and tried to email it, and that was also blocked. Then they turned around and tried to send it out to a personal website or personal email account. Those kinds of things are indicative at a certain volume of a threat. It may be someone trying to transfer their own personal information, or it could be someone who has collected a mass of data and is trying to distribute that. So if they have already classified the data, applied a label, it's very easy to look for that label in combination. This data came from this system. It has one logical attribute. This data is going to some other place. That's another logical attribute. And based on those combinations, you can take a detective or deterrent or type of a control. Yes?
And to sort of answer the first part of what you were asking, in our agency, the data is all classified as confidential by statute. And so it may not be intelligent, but the law says that, and that's what we apply it as. And so you might want to see if in your agency that's particularly the case. Outside of that, it's risk-based. What do you stand to lose if that data is gone? And based upon that, you can classify it according to the impact that it's going to have to the organization. If it's going to take you down pretty badly, like, say, for instance, Target, reputationally it's hurt them, it's going to hurt them for a few years. And maybe they probably need to up some of their protections a little bit. because they're talking about not just one customer, they're talking 40 million customers, or even potential customers that are out there that, well, you know, I don't feel like shopping there anymore. So it all depends upon what the risk is that you're willing to take. Unfortunately, that's always, that number changes, or that looks a lot different the moment after something has happened. But most people don't invest in it ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly. The loss of a few confidential records presents a lower risk than a loss of massive amounts of confidential data.
How can we get a copy of your presentation?
I believe they're making copies of all the presentations available and will be published in several weeks.
On your previous example, that business driver is not unusual, unfortunately. How did the project and the outcome, how did that help them find out how the data was being used and where it was being transferred?
So initially, we needed to get the database admins involved to look at what data they were actually collecting. Right? There was a belief that they were collecting names, addresses, socials, and a series of benefits. We needed the database administrators to validate that and also help us understand the format that they were storing certain critical components, social security numbers specifically, with a dash, without a dash, things of that nature. So we could properly develop a regular expression that would detect where the data was stored. We can do some discovery scans of the environment. We expect it to be in these databases. We do not expect it to be in these user home directories or on these systems. So once we knew where it was supposed to be and who was supposed to have access, we could start monitoring how people were using it through our DLP endpoint and network DLP solutions. Yes?
So, there are a couple of challenges in projects, like existing projects. It's really difficult to bring into all the security controls, implemented in an existing project which is going on for many years. There's a lot of resistance because it slows down the project. And also that is one challenge. And the second one is for the new project. When you look at all these controls like traffic, nest, SAM, there will be a set of like maybe say 500 or 1,000 requirements and to make sure it's a really solid, secure solution. So is it realistic to, and also these standards is so broad, and how do we actually nail down to the one we need and minimize that, the broadness of the
So the way you can begin to narrow it down is first by looking at the internal controls. You have to meet those. These things right here. So the tools and templates that are available through the Department of Technology and the Office of the CIO, including the feasibility study report, help you to identify, and the project managers identify, is there a system owner identified? Has a data owner been identified? And has the data that's going to be stored or processed been classified? And that helps you move from the SIM as a starting point to these external standards. Now, you have identified correctly that if you look at these as a whole, there are thousands of possible controls, but there's a lot of overlap. There's a common set, probably 75 to 80 or 85, that are common between all of these requirements, including a commonality between the SIM and the SAM. So you're really having to look at, ISO has, 114? A subset of that, right, based on risk. The information is public. I do not need an encryption control. It's not applicable. The information is confidential. I might need an encryption control when it's transmitted outside the organization or stored internally. So look for the overlap. ISO and a lot of the things from ISACA map across. So if you need some more information, stop by the ISSA and the ISACA chapter booths, and they can get you pointed in the right direction for some of those resources. that help identify common controls.
For the existing projects.
So for existing projects, before the system goes live, there should be an acceptance process, a risk assessment, and a vulnerability assessment before the system goes live. At that point, hopefully, your audit group and your compliance group will identify that there are required controls that are missing. Unfortunately, you might have to go back through the design phase. So it's why it's important to measure twice and cut once. Yes?
It's probably a little bit, well, I guess you were applying that to existing systems, but for new systems, they have to be baked into the requirements up front. And I know we've spent some time in our agency where it took a long time to implement those things you mentioned, including a privacy impact assessment, and we asked for a system security plan up front, and that hasn't really happened because people aren't willing to think ahead of it. They design it and then they go, oh, well, here's what we did. And that's really not, that's kind of backwards. But we've put in place some requirements for the project, and that took a lot of buy-in from upstairs because those did represent kind of roadblocks to the normal, just cramming the project through. So sometimes there's the little baby steps, but those little steps have to have a lot of punch behind each one of them so that they can be leveraged to get a much broader handle on some of these controls and accepting of risk.
Yeah, definitely. Part of that can be approached through project management at the end of the engagement, doing a project readout so you can learn from the lessons of that engagement and improve on your next one. Yes?
We actually follow NIST 864, which is security considerations and the SDLC system development lifecycle. And it lays it out very thoroughly what needs to be considered, including privacy, at all the different phases of the project.
Very good. Is that information also available through the OCIO or Office of Technology?
They basically say you need to follow NIST 853. 53 lays out the controls. 53A shows you how to assess the controls. But 64 is the one that I found helps both the business and the IT areas follow fairly easy because they've even mapped it graphically on the considerations. They're done at a very high level, but it's great for the project manager and for business and IT.
Great, thank you for sharing that. All right, I think we've got just a couple more minutes before we conclude for your next track.
And then the other one thing I wanted to add is kind of a segue to there about how to classify data. If someone were to steal our client names, it would be meaningless. If someone were to steal the client information number by itself, it would be meaningless. The help information behind that with no names, it would be meaningless. But if there was a client, a SIN number, client information number, and the help information, that might seem like it's meaningless. But if you have another database with the name and the SIN over here, if they got both of those and matched them up, then all of a sudden it's a major breach.
Yeah.
So by protecting all of those fields that can potentially be matched up, then you don't have to worry about it. Back to probably what they said about that area.
Well, we had a project done by a contractor, and there was that very argument being made, and unfortunately it had HIPAA information in that. If you can uniquely identify any individual, which could be a note that says a red-headed person you type an address, and that constitutes the breach. So you have there's all kinds of permutations that can
Exactly.
hot water. So
The zip codes can narrow people down to a location.
That's what happened with Home Depot.
Yeah. All right, so thank you all for sharing. Thank you all for your time and attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.